In a forgotten church record book, discovered in 2018 beneath the floorboards of Salem's oldest meeting house, authorities made a chilling discovery. It wasn't just dust and decay they found hidden there in the dark, it was evidence. Evidence of over 200 missing souls, names meticulously connected to the Massachusetts witch trials that history, it seems, was meant to forget. The private ledger, belonging to Salem's most powerful family, was a chronicle of terror. Next to each victim's name were execution dates, cold property valuations, and beside each one, a single, bloodless notation, acquisition complete. While the history books tell us of 19 official executions in Salem, this cursed document whispers a far more horrifying truth, a number closer to 237. Most of these poor souls were simply erased, wiped from public record through careful, calculated record-keeping. But the most disturbing detail? Every single piece of land, every home and farm belonging to the vanished, was systematically transferred to the same three men: Judge Ezekiel Blackwell, Reverend Nathaniel Blackwell, and Sheriff Josiah Blackwell. Three brothers, whose descendants, to this very day, still own over 40% of Salem's historic district. But the most haunting entry of all is the final one. Dated October 1720, it contains only 5 words written beside a young woman's name: Mercy Blackwell. Family matter resolved. Before we delve deeper into the story of the Blackwell dynasty and their reign of terror, I must warn you, this channel is not for everyone. Only those brave enough to stare into the blackest corners of our history should continue watching. If you're one of those select few who seeks out these hidden horrors, then subscribe now and tell me in the comments which state you're listening from. These are the stories most channels fear to tell, and we're just getting started. Let's travel back to Colonial, Massachusetts, where the seeds of this forgotten nightmare were first sown. The year 1692 marks not just a dark chapter in American history, but the beginning of a conspiracy far more sinister than most historians dare to acknowledge. Salem in 1692 was a community strangled by fear. Nestled within the dense, watchful forests of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, this small settlement of roughly 500 souls clung to rigid Puritan beliefs. Their faith was a flimsy shield against the vast, unknown wilderness that pressed in on all sides, and against the perceived evils they were convinced festered within their own midst. The village itself was a sparse collection of a central meeting house, a few dozen wooden homes huddled nearby for comfort, and lonely outlying farms scattered throughout the surrounding countryside. Here, the Puritan faith dominated every aspect of daily life. Strict observance wasn't just expected, it was demanded. And at the very heart of this fearful place, the Blackwell family held a position of unassailable influence. Their stately, 2-story home stood directly across from the meeting house, its glass windows, a rare and arrogant luxury, gleaming like cold, watchful eyes in the afternoon sun. Judge Ezekiel Blackwell, the eldest brother at 46, commanded the local court with an authority that was absolute. His deep-set eyes missed nothing, and his judgments were considered as final and unchangeable as Scripture itself. He maintained the appearance of Puritan humility, dressed in simple, stark black attire, but beneath that somber facade, he was secretly amassing a fortune in influence and land. Reverend Nathaniel Blackwell, 2 years his brother's junior, was the fire that fueled the fear. Each Sunday, from his pulpit, he delivered sermons of such fire and brimstone that they left the entire congregation trembling. His voice could shift in a heartbeat from a conspiratorial whisper to a thunderous, roaring condemnation that seemed to shake the very dust from the meeting house rafters. With his gaunt frame and burning, intense gaze, many in the congregation truly believed he possessed an unnatural gift, that he could stare directly into a person's soul and root out the slightest impurity festering within. Then there was Sheriff Josiah Blackwell, the youngest brother at 41. He was the iron fist that enforced the laws his brothers created and interpreted. A powerfully built man with a perpetual frown etched deep into his features. He was never seen without his distinctive walking stick its head carved into the shape of a coiled serpent. It was whispered in terrified tones throughout Essex County that this particular stick had broken more bones than any club or musket in the colony. Together, these three brothers formed an unbreakable chain of control. They held Salem in a vice grip, governing its laws, commanding its faith, and enforcing its order. Every aspect of life flowed through them. But their power was not as absolute as it once was. Salem was changing. New merchants were establishing businesses, creating unwelcome competition for the Blackwells' lucrative trading interests. Prominent families like the Putnams and the Proctors were gaining influence and wealth, their growing voices a direct threat to the brothers' iron-fisted rule. Their control was slipping. Something needed to be done to reassert their dominance. And then the first whispers of witchcraft began. They provided the perfect opportunity. The winter of 1691 to 1692 had been a cruel one, an unrelenting season of bitterness. Food stores dwindled to nothing. Illness spread like a phantom through the cramped, freezing households. Tensions festered and rose as families simply struggled to survive until a distant spring. In the Reverend's oppressive home, his 16-year-old niece, Mercy, observed the growing anxiety with a quiet, intelligent concern. The daughter of Judge Ezekiel, she had been raised in her uncle's stern household after her mother's tragic death in childbirth. This unusual upbringing had granted her an education most women could only dream of. Mercy could not only read and write English with elegance, but also decipher some Latin. She used these skills to keep the church's records. With her copper-colored hair, always meticulously tucked beneath her cap as modesty demanded, and her thoughtful, piercing gray eyes, Mercy moved through Salem like a ghost. She saw everything but spoke very little. She dutifully recorded the milestones of life in the church ledger: baptisms, marriages, and deaths. She never questioned why her uncle sometimes instructed her to make certain darker entries in a separate, smaller book, a private ledger he kept locked away in his personal desk. At night, she would often lie awake and listen to the low, urgent murmur of her father and uncles talking behind the closed door of the study. Their voices would sometimes rise in what sounded like excited, greedy planning, only to fall into a dead, suspicious silence at the slightest creak of a floorboard elsewhere in the house. Then, on one particularly bitter February evening, everything changed. Mercy was carrying an armful of firewood to her uncle's study when she froze outside the heavy oak door. Her father's voice, usually so controlled, was raised in unusual animation. "The Porter widow's land adjoins the river access we need," Ezekiel was saying, his voice sharp with desire. "With her husband gone, she'll never maintain it properly. She refused to sell to me. Twice now," replied Josiah, his deep voice a low growl of frustration. There was a pause, filled only by the crackle of the fire. Then Nathaniel spoke, his tone measured and chillingly cold. "Perhaps the widow Porter might soon face troubles of a different nature. I've heard disturbing reports. Strange behavior. Times like these require utmost vigilance against the devil's influence." A chill that had nothing to do with the winter cold shot down Mercy's spine. It was followed by a wave of pure dread as the three brothers' laughter mingled together in the firelit room, a sound that was far more terrifying than any sermon. 2 weeks later, when the first accusations of witchcraft erupted in Salem Village, that chilling conversation echoed in Mercy's mind. It was a coincidence that felt manufactured. The accusations didn't just spread. They erupted like wildfire through the dry kindling of Salem's fear. It started with young girls writhing on the meeting house floor, screaming of invisible pinches and bites. Then, respectable wives were suddenly named as consorts of Satan. Farmers were accused of blighting crops and killing livestock with a malevolent glance. And at the very center of the storm stood the Blackwell brothers. Judge Ezekiel, his face a mask of solemn duty, presiding over rushed, shambolic trials. Reverend Nathaniel, providing fiery theological justification from the pulpit, branding the accused as soldiers in Satan's army. And Sheriff Josiah, his heavy boots echoing on frozen ground as he dragged the terrified from their homes in the dead of night. What began as a spark in February, just 3 accused, had become a raging inferno by May. The jail overflowed with the weeping and the damned. The community shattered, trust evaporating as neighbor accused neighbor, old grudges now dressed up as spectral evidence. Through it all, Mercy's hand remained steady as she recorded the names in her uncle's private ledger. She tried to ignore the cold knot in her stomach, the growing dread as she recognized so many of the accused. They were the very same landowners her father had coveted. Then came the rainy April night when Widow Porter was arrested. Her screams tore through the village, a raw sound of terror that was swallowed by the downpour as Josiah and his men dragged her away. The next morning, Mercy heard her father and uncles discussing the management of the widow's property during her absence. Within a week, that prime riverside land belonged to Ezekiel, purchased for a pittance to, as he claimed, pay for her care. As spring's thaw gave way to the oppressive heat of summer, the executions began. The first to die was Bridget Bishop. Mercy watched from a distance on June 10th as the woman's body swung from a gnarled oak on Gallows Hill, her uncle's prayer for the condemned witch's soul rising into the still air. The image of that twisting shadow burned itself onto the back of Mercy's eyelids. That night, sleep was impossible. Driven by a terror greater than her fear of discovery, she slipped into her uncle's study. With trembling hands, she used a key she had secretly copied weeks before to open the locked drawer. In the dim, dancing light of a single candle, she opened the leather-bound ledger and began to read. What she found there did not just frighten her. It turned her blood to ice. This was no simple list of accusations. It was a ledger of profit and death. Alongside names and invented crimes were meticulous inventories of properties, debts, and assets. Beside each entry, cold notations detailed how these holdings had been acquired by the Blackwell brothers for a fraction of their worth. But the most horrifying revelation was on the later pages. Dozens of names she had never heard in any public trial. Names followed by execution dates and a simple, blood-chilling phrase, "Matter concluded." Or worse, acquisition complete. The truth crashed down upon her. Her father and uncles had not merely manipulated the witch trials for greed. They were conducting secret executions, erasing people who were never officially charged, their disappearances explained away as flight or abandonment. The official death toll the world would one day know was a lie, would eventually reach just 19 in the public record. But that number was a grotesque lie, completely dwarfed by the true, horrifying tally recorded in this hidden book of the dead. Just when you think you've seen the depths of human cruelty, the horror in Salem finds a way to sink even deeper. If this story is sending chills down your spine, share this video with a friend who loves a dark historical mystery. Hit that like button to support our quest to uncover these buried truths. And don't forget to subscribe so you never miss a story like this. Now, let's discover together what happens next, as Mercy Blackwell's world begins to completely unravel around her. The summer of 1692 brought no relief to Salem. If anything, the horror intensified. The humid air hung heavy and still over the settlement, but the stench of fear and suspicion was even thicker, a palpable miasma that choked the very soul of the village. The trials continued at a frantic, nightmarish pace. Judge Ezekiel Blackwell presided over hearings that were little more than a formality, rarely lasting more than an hour before a guilty verdict was pronounced from his unsmiling lips. The accused were given a diabolical choice: confess to witchcraft and implicate your neighbors, or maintain your innocence and face the noose on Gallows Hill. Mercy watched with a sickness growing in her gut as more and more names filled the pages of her uncle's secret ledger. The pattern was now unmistakable, a map of greed written in blood. Those who owned valuable property, or who had openly opposed the Blackwell family's interests, were disproportionately targeted, their fates sealed not by spectral evidence, but by cold, calculated avarice. Even more disturbing were the private examinations conducted not in the courthouse, but but in the dank, stone-walled basement of the Blackwell home. This was where Sheriff Josiah employed his own brutal methods of persuasion. His techniques left prisoners with broken fingers, dislocated joints, and sometimes injuries far, far worse. On a particularly oppressive July evening, the air so thick it was hard to breathe, Mercy was instructed to bring refreshments to her father and uncles in the basement. Descending the narrow, creaking stairs, the bitter, metallic smell of copper and the sour stench of sweat assaulted her senses before her eyes could even adjust to the gloom. In the flickering lantern light, she saw him. Goodman Thomas Putnam, a prosperous farmer who had publicly refused to sell his mill to Ezekiel, was strapped to a heavy wooden chair. His face was a swollen, purple mask, nearly unrecognizable from the beating he had endured. His fingers were splayed at unnatural, stomach-turning angles, each one systematically broken. "Oh, Mercy!" "Just in time," her father said, his voice chillingly casual as he took the tray from her trembling hands. Goodman Putnam has just had a most fortunate recollection. He remembers witnessing Goody Proctor communing with the devil down by the mill stream. "Isn't that fortunate?" Putnam's eyes, swollen nearly shut, managed to find Mercy's across the shadowy room. A desperate, broken whisper escaped his bloody lips. "They made me say it. God forgive me. They made me say it." The crack of Sheriff Josiah's serpent-headed walking stick across Putnam's jaw was a sickening, wet sound of finality. "The devil makes you say many things, Putnam," Josiah growled. "But now you speak God's truth, do you not?" Mercy fled back upstairs, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped, frantic bird. That night, shaking and unable to sleep, she crept once more into her uncle's study. With steady, determined hands, she made careful copies of several pages from the secret ledger, the most damning evidence of all. She hid the papers beneath a loose floorboard in her bedroom. Whatever happened next, someone needed to know the truth of what the Blackwell brothers had done. And as August's heat arrived, a new, disturbing development emerged from the shadows. Several accused witches had somehow managed to escape from the Salem jail. The official story, spread by Sheriff Josiah himself, was that they had fled into the wilderness rather than face trial. But Mercy, her hands trembling as she continued to secretly access the ledger, found a very different truth etched in its pages. The names of these so-called escaped prisoners appeared with notations that made her blood run cold. Questioned privately, disposed of swamp burial. One entry in particular struck her with the force of a physical blow. Rachel Nurse, resistant to questioning. Eliminated quietly. Property transferred successfully. Family informed of escape to Rhode Island. The realization was a cold, sharp knife in her heart. Her uncles and father were not just manipulators, they were murderers. The public hangings were merely a spectacle, a mask for a far more sinister operation happening in the shadows. They were quietly eliminating anyone who resisted their schemes, burying them in unmarked graves and telling their families a convenient lie. Driven by a desperate need for justice, Mercy began taking calculated, terrifying risks. She volunteered to deliver food to the wretched souls in the Salem jail, smuggling in tiny scraps of paper and nubs of charcoal so the accused could write down their true testimonies, their stories of what really happened in the Blackwell's basement. She quietly approached the grieving relatives of the escaped, asking seemingly innocent questions about whether they'd received any word from their missing loved ones. The answers, always a shaken head, always a story of sudden, silent disappearance, only confirmed her worst fears. Most damning of all, she began creating her own secret ledger. Page by page, she documented the sprawling, blood-soaked web of properties her family was acquiring. It was a map of their monstrous greed. By September, the Blackwell brothers' holdings stretched across Essex County. Judge Ezekiel now owned 3 mills, vast tracts of farmland, and several key commercial buildings in Salem town. Reverend Nathaniel had seized the properties of 2 rival churches. Sheriff Josiah controlled the vital riverside, giving him a stranglehold over all shipping access. Their wealth had multiplied exponentially in just 7 months of terror. But a resistance was stirring. The influential minister Cotton Mather had written from Boston, expressing grave doubts about the spectral evidence used in the trials. Respected community members like Rebecca Nurse and John Proctor had been executed despite a flood of character testimonies in their favor, and their deaths had sown seeds of doubt among the people. Sensing the tide beginning to turn, the Blackwell brothers grew frantic. Their secret ledger now contained a new, horrifying section, a list of priority acquisitions, names of the wealthiest, most influential families in the colony who had yet to be accused. Their downfall would cement Blackwell control for generations. On a rain-soaked evening in late September, Mercy was hunched over her bed, adding another damning entry to her collection of evidence, when a floorboard creaked behind her. Her heart stopped. She turned with a start to find her cousin, William, Sheriff Josiah's son, standing in her doorway. His eyes were not on her, but fixed on the damning documents spread across her bed. "I knew someone was accessing Father's study," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "I never imagined it was you." For a long, breathless moment, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the frantic hammering of Mercy's heart in her own ears. Then, William stepped forward, closing the door behind him with a soft, final click. "They'll kill you if they discover this," he whispered, his eyes darting to the damning notes spread across her bed. Mercy straightened her back, bracing for the accusation, for the betrayal. "Will you tell them?" William hesitated, a war of emotions playing out across his face. Then he shook his head slowly. "No, because what they're doing is wrong. I've known it for months. I was just too afraid to speak." He sat heavily on the edge of her bed, the weight of his confession seeming to crush him. "Last week, I followed my father and two of his deputies into the woods north of town. They were dragging something wrapped in canvas. I watched them." His voice broke, thick with a horror he could not unsee. "I watched them bury Goodwife Foster in an unmarked grave. She didn't escape to Rhode Island. She never left." A surge of desperate hope flooded Mercy's chest at finding an unexpected ally, but it was instantly tempered by cold, sharp fear. "We need proof," she insisted. "Proof that others will believe. My word against my father's, or yours against your uncle's. It won't be enough. They'll silence us both." "There's a meeting tomorrow night," William said after a long, heavy pause. "All three of them. In Uncle Ezekiel's study. They're planning something big. Something they're calling the final acquisition phase. If we could somehow hear what they're planning." The following night, shrouded in darkness, Mercy and William concealed themselves in a small, forgotten storage space adjacent to Judge Ezekiel's study. They had carefully loosened a narrow panel in the wall, and now they pressed their ears to the thin wood, listening as the Blackwell brothers gathered around the judge's desk. "The timing must be perfect," Ezekiel was saying, his quill scratching across parchment like a scurrying insect. "When Governor Phipps returns from Boston next month, these trials may be restricted. We must secure the remaining properties before then." "The list is ambitious," Nathaniel observed. 17 families in 3 weeks. "Even with our efficient methods, that presents challenges." "We'll accelerate the private examinations," Josiah replied, his voice cold and utterly devoid of emotion. "Those who won't confess and implicate others need not reach the public gallows. The swamp has room enough." "What of the Corwin estate?" Ezekiel asked. "That's the prize that will establish our shipping monopoly." "I've already planted evidence at Corwin's home," Josiah said with grim satisfaction. "A puppet with pins hidden beneath the floorboards of his kitchen. We'll discover it tomorrow during a search. By week's end, his properties will be ours." As the brothers continued to detail their monstrous plan, Mercy and William exchanged horrified glances in the suffocating darkness of their hiding place. The scale of the conspiracy was even vaster than they had imagined. This wasn't just about isolated acquisitions. It was a systematic, cold-blooded coup to seize control of the entire region's commerce and governance. When the meeting finally concluded, the two cousins slipped away to the relative safety of the stable, where the steady stamping and snorting of the horses would mask their terrified whispers. "We need to get this information to Governor Phipps directly," William insisted, his voice urgent. My father has men watching all the roads, but I know trails through the forest. I could reach Boston in 2 days if I leave tonight. Mercy shook her head, a new, terrifying plan forming in her mind. They'd notice your absence immediately. They'd come for you. I should go. They pay less attention to my comings and goings. Mercy insisted, her voice a tight whisper. It's too dangerous for you to travel alone. It's more dangerous to remain. William countered, his eyes wide with fear. Tomorrow they plan to search the Corwin home for that planted evidence. What if they decide to search our rooms as well? They'd find everything. After a heated, whispered debate, they reached a desperate compromise. William would create a diversion the following evening, something that would draw all eyes to the North Road, while Mercy slipped away south toward Boston, a bundle of damning evidence hidden on her person. She would take her documentation, including the copied pages from the secret ledger, directly to Governor Phipps. The next day passed with excruciating slowness. Every creak of the floorboards, every raised voice, sent a jolt of terror through Mercy's heart. She made her careful preparations, stitching the copied ledger pages into the lining of her cloak and securing a small packet of food. As dusk painted the sky in shades of violet and gloom, William departed on his errand, promising to start a small, controlled fire in an abandoned barn north of town, enough to draw attention, but not endanger anyone. Mercy waited in her room, her small travel sack hidden beneath her bed, listening for the alarm that would be her signal to run. Finally, the church bell began to toll, a frantic, clanging sound that signaled an emergency. Her heart leapt. This was it. But the sound that came next was not the distant shouts of men running north. It was the violent crash of her own bedroom door bursting open. Sheriff Josiah stood in the doorway, flanked by two of his hulking deputies, his face a mask of cold, triumphant fury. Mercy Blackwell, he intoned formally, his voice like grinding stone. You are hereby charged with witchcraft and conspiracy against godly authority. Behind him appeared her father and uncle, their expressions unreadable, their eyes as dark and empty as a starless night. Search her room, Ezekiel ordered, his voice devoid of all warmth, all familiarity. The devil leaves evidence of his influence. With practiced, brutal efficiency, the deputies tore apart her small chamber. It took them less than a minute to find her hidden documents and the travel sack. Josiah took the papers, his face darkening with volcanic rage with each page he reviewed. It seems my niece has been quite busy, he said, handing the damning evidence to his brothers. Recording her meetings with the Dark One, planning to spread vile lies about godly men. How did you know? Mercy whispered, her voice barely a breath, her world crumbling around her. Ezekiel stepped forward, his cold eyes fixing on hers, seeing not a daughter, but a problem to be solved. William has always been a loyal son, he said, each word a needle of ice in her heart. Did you truly believe he would betray his family for a foolish girl's fantasies? The betrayal struck her with the force of a physical blow. She had trusted him completely. She had walked right into the trap he had laid. Take her to the special holding room, Nathaniel instructed, his voice dripping with false piety. We'll begin her examination immediately. By morning, I expect she'll be eager to confess her sins and name her accomplices. As the deputies dragged her from the room, Mercy caught a final, devastating glimpse of William standing in the shadows of the hallway. His face was a carefully constructed blank slate. Only the slight, uncontrollable trembling of his hands betrayed any emotion as he watched his cousin being taken away to her fate. The special holding room was, in fact, the root cellar beneath the meeting house. A damp, windowless pit that smelled of earth and decay, where the Blackwells conducted their most private interrogations. As Mercy was roughly secured to a familiar, scarred chair, the horrifying realization finally crashed down upon her. Her fate would never be recorded in the official proceedings of the Salem trials. Like so many others before her, she would simply disappear. Another name to be quietly added to the secret ledger. Another victim of her family's ruthless, all-consuming ambition. The heavy door groaned shut, sealing Mercy in the damp, earthen darkness. Ezekiel stood alone before her, the leather-bound ledger, the very book that had started her investigation, cradled in his hands like a dark Bible. "I had such hopes for you," he said, his voice almost a sigh as he placed the book on a small, rough-hewn table. "Intelligence and obedience, a rare combination. You could have been so very useful to our family's future." "How many?" Mercy asked, the question clawing its way past her fear. "How many innocent people have you murdered for their property?" Ezekiel shrugged, a gesture so casual it was more terrifying than any outburst of rage. "People die in times of crisis, some publicly as examples to others, some more discreetly, when public executions might raise uncomfortable questions." He opened the ledger to its final pages. The parchment whispered like a dry leaf. "The official record will show 19 executions when this business concludes." The actual number, he smiled, a thin, bloodless curve of his lips. "Let's just say the Blackwell legacy will be secure for generations to come." "You won't get away with this," Mercy insisted, though her voice wavered, betraying her terror. "Governor Phipps will investigate. Others are already questioning the trials. By the time any investigation occurs," Ezekiel said, picking up a quill and dipping it deliberately in an inkwell, "evidence will be scarce, and witnesses will be scarcer still." He held the quill poised over the page. "Now, I have a final entry to make in this book. The question is, what shall I write beside your name, daughter?" The tension in that root cellar would mark the turning point in Salem's darkest chapter, though few would ever know the full, horrifying truth of what transpired there. As the events in Salem reached their bloody climax in October of 1692, a remarkable confluence of circumstances altered the course of history. Governor William Phipps, returning early from Boston, issued a stunning proclamation forbidding further arrests based on spectral evidence. Though Mercy Blackwell's whereabouts remained unrecorded in any official document from the period, a mysterious packet, a letter containing detailed evidence of judicial misconduct and property seizures, along with copied pages from a secret ledger, reached the governor's office just before his declaration. The true turning point came on October 29, 1692. Colonial officials, acting on an anonymous tip, conducted an unannounced inspection of the court records. It was during this search that the Blackwell brothers' private ledger was discovered. The brothers vanished that same night, along with several deputies loyal to Sheriff Josiah. Rumors spread like fog. They had fled to Virginia, perhaps, or taken ship for the Caribbean, vanishing with a substantial portion of Salem's wealth. For decades, the full, monstrous extent of the Blackwells' crimes remained buried. The colony, desperate to move beyond the shame of the witch trials, focused only on the 19 official victims, never daring to investigate the disappearances that would have revealed a far more extensive and sinister conspiracy. Families of the missing were left with only their grief and unanswered questions, many forced to accept the hollow official explanation that their loved ones had simply fled the colony in fear. It wasn't until 1720, nearly 30 years after the trials had ended and the screams had faded to whispers, that a startling discovery brought the haunting legacy of the Blackwells back into the light. Workers renovating the old Salem meeting house, the very epicenter of the terror, uncovered a hidden chamber concealed beneath the main floor. A forgotten, windowless room whose walls were not made of stone and mortar alone, but of memory and anguish, every inch scratched with dozens of names, dates, and final, desperate prayers, revealed evidence far more grim than anyone could have imagined. The dark soil was saturated with extensive blood stains, and the ground outside concealed multiple shallow graves. Among the few items recovered from that terrible place was a small journal, its pages water-damaged and warped with time, but still partially legible. The author, identified only by the initials B, had documented the final, terrifying days of her imprisonment and the unexpected turn of events that had allowed her to cheat the fate her own family had planned for her. Though many pages were a blurred, unreadable ruin, one passage stood out with chilling, crystalline clarity. When they came for me that final night, I believed death was certain. But as Uncle Josiah raised his knife, a commotion above stayed his hand. William appeared at the cellar door, not as my betrayer, but as my savior, having alerted the governor's men to our location. In the chaos that followed, I witnessed what I can only describe as divine justice. My father and uncles, the architects of so much suffering, fleeing like common criminals into the waiting darkness. I know they will not stop. Wherever they have gone, their ambition and cruelty will continue to fester. I make this record so that those who come after will know the truth of what happened in Salem. Not a supernatural panic, but a calculated scheme of murder and theft disguised as religious zeal. The official records show 19 victims. The true number approaches 237 souls. Their names are recorded in the Blackwell ledger, and on these very walls where so many breathed their last. I write this in October 1720, having returned to Salem after years in hiding, determined that the truth will not remain buried forever. The journal ends abruptly, mid-sentence, its final page stained with a dark, rusty substance that appears to be blood. No record exists of what became of Mercy Blackwell after this entry. Local legend, passed down in hushed tones, suggests she may have been the final victim of her family's bloody legacy, tracked down and silenced by relatives determined to protect the Blackwell name for all time. The passage of time often buries the darkest secrets, but sometimes the truth finds a way to surface, no matter how deep the grave. In the centuries since, the Blackwell descendants scattered throughout New England, many changing their name to escape the growing, poisonous rumors of their ancestors' crimes. Property records show that much of Salem's most valuable land remained in Blackwell-connected families until the mid-19th century, the blood-soaked origins of their wealth obscured by time and deliberate omission. Perhaps most disturbing is the recent discovery of letters dating from 1695 to 1730. They suggest the Blackwell brothers did not fade into obscurity, but established a new power base in the southern colonies, where they continued their practice of manipulating local justice for financial gain. Reports of mysterious disappearances and unexplained property transfers followed their movements like a plague, though no formal charges were ever brought against them. The Salem Witch Trials remain one of America's most infamous miscarriages of justice, but the traditional narrative captures only the public face of a much darker, more calculated conspiracy. While scholars debate the exact number of victims and the full, horrifying extent of the plot, one thing is certain. The horror did not end on Gallows Hill. It simply packed its ledger, changed its name, and moved south. Extent of the Blackwell's crimes. The mounting evidence points to a systematic campaign of terror and acquisition that far exceeded the official record. This mystery shows us that the most terrifying monsters in history are rarely supernatural beings. They are humans, driven by greed, shielded by power, and hidden in plain sight. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed in that hidden chamber, or are there still Blackwell secrets waiting to be discovered, buried in the foundations of old houses or hidden within family archives? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. If this tale of buried truth and historical horror gripped you, make sure you subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss a story. Share this with someone who loves unraveling dark mysteries from our past. Remember, this channel isn't for everyone. It's only for those brave enough to face the darkest truths history has to offer. Until next time.